Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why some ideas just stick with you, even if you are not sure they're true? Today, we're diving into a fascinating study that looks at how we decide if something is true, especially when it is put in front of us multiple times. You know that feeling when you hear something so often, you start to believe it is real, even if it is not. That is the truth effect. And it is a powerful thing. But what happens when we hear these statements not just repeatedly, but in different languages? Do we still believe them just as much? That is the big question researchers wanted to answer. So imagine you have a trivia fact. Researchers took these facts and created slightly different versions, where one was true and one was false. But they looked very similar. For example, a true statement might be Singapore gained independence from Malaysia. They'd make a false version like Singapore gained independence from Indonesia. The only difference is that one word. But it completely changes the truth. They did this for 100 facts and then translated everything into English, Spanish, and Italian. Then they gathered people from each language group. The English speakers, about 60 of them, were in the US or Canada. Then they had around 85 Spanish speakers from Spain and about 87 Italian speakers from Italy. These folks were asked to read these trivia statements and rate how true they thought each one was, on a scale from definitely false to definitely true. They had to do this pretty quickly, only 12 seconds. Per statement. They also threw in some attention checks, asking participants to rate a statement in a specific way to make sure everyone was paying attention. Now, the cool part, the results. What they found was pretty surprising. Across all three languages, the true and false versions of the trivia statements didn't get rated all that differently. People didn't clearly say this is true and this is false. It was much blurrier than you might expect. This means that for these lesser-known facts, the false versions were often just as believable as the true ones, especially when people hadn't heard them before. This is a big deal because it shows how plausible misinformation can be, even in its initial exposure. They also looked at how fast people responded in English and Italian. People tended to respond faster to statements they rated as more truthful, which kind of makes sense. If you believe something, you might answer quicker. But here is where it gets even more interesting. When they compared the results across the languages, they noticed some differences. The way Spanish and Italian speakers rated the statements and how they responded was more similar to each other than to the English speakers. This makes sense because Spanish and Italian are more closely related languages than English is to them, because they're closer linguistically, they're processing fluency. Meaning how easily they process the language might be more similar, leading to more similar judgments. Also, the English speakers were recruited from North America, while the Spanish and Italian speakers were from Europe, so cultural differences might also play a role. They also looked at two other things, plausibility and discriminability. Plausibility is like how believable the general idea of the statement is, ignoring the specific true or false detail. Discriminability is how well people could tell the true statement apart from the false one. They found that people in different language groups generally agreed on what sounded plausible, meaning the general gist of the stories was similarly believable. However, they didn't agree as much on which specific details were easier to distinguish as true or false. This is important. It suggests that while we might all agree on the general vibe of something, the very specific facts can be harder to nail down. And this difference can be even more pronounced across languages and cultures. It implies that knowing the difference between true and false details might rely more on specific. Learn knowledge that can vary a lot from culture to culture. Whereas general believability might come from more shared everyday experiences. They also did a bit of a deep dive using something called representational similarity analysis. Basically, they used a computer program that understands language to see how similar the sentences were semantically. They found a small link between how semantically similar two statements were and how similar people rated their truthfulness. This means that sentences that meant very similar things sometimes got rated similarly. But this effect was quite small. It suggests that just because two statements sound alike doesn't mean they'll be judged the same way in terms of truth. So, what does all of this mean for us? Well, this study gives us a really valuable set of tools for researchers. They've created these norm trivia statements in 3 languages that can be used to study how people believe things. This can help scientists understand the truth effect better, especially when comparing how people from different language backgrounds react to information. It is also a good reminder that we all need to be a bit more critical. especially with information we encounter frequently. The researchers themselves point out a couple of things to keep in mind. First, these trivia facts were chosen because people generally don't know them well. This was important for creating believable false statements. So, this study might not tell us much about how the truth effect works for things we already know a lot about. Second, most of these facts are about regions outside of North America and Europe. So, if you are from one of those regions, you might find these facts easier to distinguish as true or false than the participants in the study did. Overall, this is a really important study because it has provided a resource for future research. It highlights that language and culture can influence how we perceive truth, even when the information is presented in a similar way. It also cautions us about how easily false information can seem believable, especially when it is repeated. It makes you wonder how this applies to the information we see every day, especially online. Could the truth effect be manipulating our beliefs on a much larger scale than we think? What are your thoughts on the truth effect? Do you find yourself believing something just because you've heard it a lot? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this breakdown, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more deep dives into the science of the mind. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.